Okay, I think it's time we start. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second installment of the Populism Seminar. My name is Annika Werner. I'm from the Australian National University in Canberra, and it's my great pleasure to welcome all of you and to chair the session today. Now, today, this is the first session that we have in a panel style, which means that we have two speakers who will report their insights from their own research. And then we'll have open Q&A for all of your questions and comments. And before I introduce the topic and the speaker, I just want to very briefly introduce or remind you of the sort of general rules of how you can ask questions or make comments. And the first thing is actually, the first rule that I have to mention is that this webinar is being recorded. Now you won't be able to open your video, so your face is definitely not going to be recorded, except for those of us on the panel here. However, if you ask a question out loud, then your voice will be recorded. And asking a question out loud is one of the ways you can ask a question or make a comment. At the bottom of your screen, you should see the raise your hand button. If you click on that, then I will be able to unmute your microphone and you can ask your question, make your comment. The other option that you have, if you're feeling a bit shy or don't want to wait until the end of a presentation, you will also find at the bottom of your screen the Q&A button where you can ask a question or make a comment, and my wonderful co-convener Robert Hubert from the University of Salzburg will collect these questions and comments and then basically speak them out for you. Now, in both ways, when you make, whether you make your question or comment written or saying it out loud, we ask you to keep it succinct so that we can have as many questions and as many comments as possible. Now, as you all know, today's session is titled Populist in Government. Now, when we discuss populists and the consequences of populism, when these actors actually take on governing powers, that is arguably the most direct way to exert influence. And that begs the questions, what does that do to the populists themselves once they get into government? But it also begs the question, what do they do in terms of policies, and what does it do to the state and to democracy when these kind of actors are in power? And I'm very happy to welcome two international experts on exactly these kind of topics, who are going to present their insights and their sort of big question and big answers today. And our two presenters that I would like to introduce are Jakob Schwörer, a postdoctoral researcher from the Leuphana University in Lüneburg and from the Uppsala University, as well as Paul Kenny from the Australian Catholic University in Melbourne. And we asked both Jakob and Paul to talk for a maximum of 10 minutes and to really focus on their big questions and their big findings. So if you have any specific methodological questions, you can ask them afterwards, but we really would like to have a big discussion on the big series and the big insights on what is happening in the world. And without further ado, I would like to hand over to Jakob for his big questions and big answers.
So yeah, thank you. I just see that I cannot stop my video, so maybe someone of you needs to do it. I try to share my screen. All right, here I am. All right. Yeah. So thank you for having me. I'm very happy to participate here in this nice seminar. So I will present some simple descriptive findings today from my recent paper published in Government and Opposition regarding discursive consequences of incumbent populists. And at the end, I will briefly mention some implications, some consequences of the findings of my paper and of related research on this large topic of mainstreaming of populist and nativist discourses. I don't focus, as you suggested, much on conceptual stuff, so I'll run through the first slides here. So far, scholars focused on different aspects of populist government participation, right? On the consequences for liberal democracy, or press freedom, right? Like Paul's upcoming article, on policies, electoral consequences, but we know almost nothing about how populist discourses develop or change in coalition governments. And there is little research, right? But we find widespread theoretical assumptions about moderation effects of government participation, right? So deliberation and compromises are required in coalitions, as usually assumed, right? In order to remain in office. And this is expected to tame populist radicalism, populist anti-establishment discourses, right? So in order to not threaten the survival of the coalition, populists should tone down their rhetoric, right? And this is actually what I wanted to do in order to assess whether this moderation thesis indeed can be observed empirically. I conduct a quantitative content analysis measuring different elements of populist communication. So if you'd like to know more about that, maybe we can discuss that later. I focus on 5 populist parties, and I focus on Facebook communication, so one specific type of political communication, before and after entering coalitions. I will present some very simple descriptive findings now. I think this is maybe the most reasonable approach for the remaining time. So what you see actually here is the percentage of antagonisms constructed by populist parties. So antagonisms often assumed as a core feature of populism, right, between the people on the one side, and in this table, the people versus political, economic elites, media elites, and in some cases also supposed non-native outgroups. And the simple descriptive number here already indicates that it does not decrease a lot in government, right? These kind of antagonisms discursively constructed by populists are not usually higher in opposition, maybe except New Zealand First. So Populist Party New Zealand, but regarding the other cases, there's at least no substantial decrease, right? And this is also presented here in this table, where I distinguish between different targets opposed to the people or the nation. So political elites, economic elites, non-native outgroups, those targets most often juxtaposed to the people, right? And it's kind of a similar picture, right? Again, maybe except New Zealand First, you see here a sharp drop. Political elites are less often opposed to the people, economic elites as well. And maybe regarding Podemos in Spain, they do less often oppose economic elites to the people when in government. But maybe except these findings, there is no clear trend, right? So at least we don't see here a clear moderation or let's say less frequent populist discourses, right? One might argue that there are other influential factors, right? We should think of, so not only incumbency, but also others which are often discussed in spatial models of party competition, like vote losses for populist parties, or public opinion shifts like towards more distrust in political institutions and parties. So one might assume that if there is some change on these variables, the populist parties may decrease or increase their populist discourses, right? But again, here it still remains unclear what determines these shifts in populism degrees, and these explanations do not offer very solid indicators for these discursive shifts. So I will now briefly conclude just these findings, right? And then I would like to talk a little bit, also briefly, about the consequences of these findings and the implications of related research, because I think this is maybe also interesting for the discussion afterwards. So first, I couldn't find a clear tendency of moderation effects, right? Maybe except in New Zealand, and also other potential explanations from economic theories of party competition do not apply. Why is this the case? I think one partial explanation might be what once Benjamin Moffat claimed, that populists actively perform a sense of crisis rather than just reacting to external crisis. Though they are rather agenda setters than just reacting to external changes. So populists may be less influenced by such external factors than, for instance, mainstream parties, right? But of course, like on the country level, there are different factors which indeed have an impact on discourses, what clearly could be observed within the sample. So for instance, the emergence of Vox in Spain as a second populist party was reflected in the communication of Podemos, or in Italy, the discord between the Five Star Movement and the League was also clearly seen in the discourses of these parties. So actually, I think what is important, what I think I can clearly state based on these now here descriptive findings, that we at least should not expect that populist and nativist discourses necessarily decrease in government, right? And what does that mean? And I think this is an important question. We know that messages, populist messages, nativist messages spread by politicians also have an impact on public attitudes, right? Mostly on the own supporters, right? Their own followers. So they may become, let's say, roughly speaking, more nativist, more populist, right? But you could argue, as long as these populist far-right parties remain on the fringe of the political spectrum, they also might have not such an effect on large parts of society, on public attitudes, maybe, again, mostly on their own supporters. But this might change if these fringe parties enter the mainstream, become governing parties where their messages might appear more acceptable, and might also have a larger impact because they reach a larger audience, right, as government. And this might be one maybe worrying consequence, what might be observed as a discursive consequence, right? I'm not talking about policies here, but discourses which remain kind of the same as before entering governments. And just one last point, and then I finish. I think the mainstreaming of nativist and populist messages is not only restricted to what I presented here, the populist parties' discourses. And I agree here with Cristobal, who claims that we should focus much more on mainstream parties, right? Because they form governments and are at least actors which reach a broader public audience and might therefore influence public attitudes to a larger extent. And we know that especially mainstream parties from the center-right are often prone to adopt nativist or anti-pluralist rhetoric when they are put under pressure. In a recent paper with my colleague, Belén Fernández Garcia from Spain, we found, for instance, that mainstream parties increasingly adopt anti-Islam messages, not only against fundamentalist Islam, but also against Islam as religion or against moderate Islam, right? You see on the right some figures from my upcoming book indicating that mainstream parties are prone to adopt messages against outgroups when external pressure increases. And we also know that from other research, right? So I show the figures here, of course, for the purpose of self-promotion. But I think Cristobal's book will also be published soon about similar topics, and others like Tariq Abu-Chadi have been working on similar topics. So again, what I want to say is that if we talk about the consequences for democracy of the mainstreaming of populism and nativism, I think we also should focus a bit more on the behavior of mainstream parties, even though this is kind of, yeah, I focus here on populist parties. So why do I say that? I just think that it is important. And that's why I made this last point. And yeah, looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jakob. And unfortunately, our second presenter hasn't shown up so far. Who knows what is going on in Melbourne at the moment. So I would like to invite the audience to come in and ask questions to Jakob about populist parties and their behavior, or about mainstream parties and their reactions. Please do come in. Robert, do we have any questions in the Q&A section?
Thus far, no. Oh, one question by Jasmine. Let me open the mic for you.
I've just opened the mic to you.
I hope it has worked. Yes. All right. Thank you so much for the presentation. I thought it was really interesting. I was wondering about your conclusion that economic theories do not apply, because you argued that they would say that populists also want to remain in office just as other politicians, obviously. And I always wonder, well, do they have to tone down for that? Because don't populist voters share these anti-elitist, etc. attitudes? So it would actually be smarter for populists to just stay on their course, be just as radical, to show their voters that they're actually staying true to what they promised before.
Yeah, should I just respond directly, or do you want to collect? All right, you're right, and I would agree with you, but I think this argument is mostly valid for, or would be valid for non-coalition governments, right? So the main argument here from these moderation thesis is not that much that the voters might leave the party, but that the coalition partner might be not happy with such a radical tone, right? So especially if the coalition partner is not a populist party. So this might lead to severe consequences. But you're right. I think the theoretical argument behind that is that indeed populist parties are still seen as office seekers, as mainstream parties, and this is the underlying theoretical explanation for that, right?
Thanks for your response to this question. There has been another question in the chat wondering about the role of sentiment and emotions in the discourse that you looked at, right? At the moment you presented different categories. Can you say a bit more about the sentiment of these messages as well?
Sorry. Now, I'm not sure if I got the question right. I just had some connecting problems, I think, but it was about the messages I measured. So
the question is whether you can tell a bit more about the sentiment and the emotions in these messages. So have they changed, right? You talked very much about the content thus far, and there was one question in the chat about this.
Yes, so maybe I should explain a little bit more what I actually measured. So I had several different categories, and I just showed tables for one or two different ones. So maybe I have here on my slides one category system that I think this was the right one. Maybe I can just share my screen again in order to show that. So this is actually what I measured. because I already thought that there might be some question in this respect. And what I think the last category is that what I presented here in the presentation, these antagonisms, right? So between the people, the nation, and different targets, different actors. So like the populist antagonisms between elites and the people, right? This is the one essential category, and the other one is between supposed non-native outgroups, like the target of far-right populists, right? And I think this is like an element of nativist communication, right? Portraying non-native outgroups as not belonging to the people, to the native society. And I think this is a broader debate about what is actually threatening here. So which elements of these discourses are threatening? And I think this is a crucial, the main message I would see here is that the nativist part is the major problem. So this wasn't part of my research, but we know that these messages have an impact on society, right? If you portray outgroups frequently as a threat, as a problem for society, as not belonging to the nation state, this raises specific attitudes among parts of society, right? So it's here about frequency. I measured kind of the frequency, right? I did not go very much in depth into the single categories, but this is a main argument that stands behind my implication, my conclusion that this may be threatening. That yes, at least for non-native outgroups, for those who according to the nativist worldview, do not belong to the native nation state, I think for them it's a problem, and for political culture maybe as well, right? If these fears are spreading across society when populist ones are in government and not only reach their own followers, but now maybe even larger parts of society.
Could you maybe elaborate a bit more on this very last part? There has been a question in the Q&A about what actually the underlying problem is you see when it comes to the spread of nativism and nativist messages. So what's the problem here for democracy or society, which you briefly tapped into just at the very end of your previous response?
Yeah, I think we should distinguish here between different dimensions. I focus here on discourses, right? I do not focus directly on nativist policies, but on nativist discourses. I mean, nativism, maybe we should just start with that as kind of an ideology with specific discursive consequences, portray the nation state as threatened by supposed non-native outgroups, right? Non-native elements, which may change over time. So this might be Islam, this might be immigrants, this might be cultural, religious groups who are portrayed as not belonging to the nation state. And I think there is a large agreement also among colleagues and scholars that this is a problem for a pluralist society, which is not based on such a nativist framing of a nation state, right? And what I think was my point, why the findings here tend to be rather worrying, that we know that if politicians, if parties formulate such discourses, portray outgroups as a problem for society, portray Islam as not belonging to the nation state, and so on, that this raises specific attitudes or strengthens specific hostile attitudes among society, right? We know that especially, I think in the context of the far right, like if the far right blames whatever Islam of, being the threat, then such messages have an impact on the own supporters, right? On the own voters, maybe, or at least on a part of their electoral group. And my argument now is, okay, this is a problem, but as long as these parties do not enter the government or do not become major political forces, they still are restricted to their own supporter base, right? These messages may not spread into the mainstream of society, to the center voters, but as soon as they become mainstream parties, the radical right, in the sense of maybe entering government, I mean, I'm not sure if this already is enough to be called mainstream parties, but they have now the opportunity to communicate through other channels, right, to reach larger parts of society. And this is why I think we could expect that then the messages diffuse in society. They become widespread, not only to the voters of this party, but maybe even other people might think now, okay, this is a governing party, right? So this might be more acceptable for people to hear these messages from governing parties than from opposition parties, because, all right, they got a certain amount of votes, they take political responsibility. This cannot be that wrong, right? This was like my interpretation of the normative consequences of these findings.
Excellent, thanks a lot. There have been actually several questions in the chat. Let me try to run through them. So Jakob Ebel asked you whether we have also seen a tendency of different actors that are at the core of populist criticism, right? So moving away from elites to, say, media or science academia. And do you expect to see similar results for these groups as well, and to what extent? And related to this question, do you think that social media communication is representative of the populist communication more generally? And do we expect large shifts and changes here over time?
Yes, I just was reading the comments here in the comment box as well. Okay, it's about the question, the first part addressed like which actors are actually portrayed as a problem for the nation and for the people. So primarily it's focusing just on the populist antagonism, it's political elites. This is the major target. So this means, I mean, I distinguished here, right? I just presented some very general findings here, but I distinguished, for instance, between portraying the political elite as a whole, like the establishment, the political parties, and between references to single parties, which might also be labeled kind of negative campaigning, right? So there are different subgroups. And the same applies for other elites, like economic elites, for instance, are often portrayed as a problem. I mean, this is the second most frequently occurring category, I think, like large corporations, for instance, powerful groups, right? So really powerful groups, which are opposed to the people and portrayed as a problem. And the last group is the nativist vision of targets, like mostly immigrants, mostly Muslims, but of course this depends on the host ideology of the populist party. Like Podemos does not frame outgroups as a problem for the nation state. Neither does the Five-Star Movement, I think, in Italy, at least among these channels I analyzed. So I think there are different types of targets, but this depends totally on the host ideology of the party, right? If it's just right-wing, left-wing populists portray economic groups more often as a problem for society, right-wing populists, non-native outgroups. And I think the other question was about the channel I analyzed, am I right? Like the sources?
Exactly. So the second question was about how representative you think that the social media communication of populist parties actually is for their overall communication.
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, this is a restriction of the study. I only focus on social media. But maybe one thing that we observed in another study in this paper I very shortly mentioned here in Party Politics last year, or I think it was even another article we published last year. We analyzed both in a different context. So nativist discursive constructions on Facebook and in election programs by radical right parties. And the findings indicated that there are actually no very substantial differences between these sources when it's about nativist messages, right? So this might be different regarding other aspects, but at least I can say that regarding the framings of Islam, if parties rejected Islam on Facebook, they also rejected them in the manifesto and vice versa. So this was actually very similar findings. So I think this might also could be true for other sources, but again, this is just I think so, but I cannot prove it.
Thank you. So there are 2 more questions. Please feel free to ask more questions through the Q&A or through raising your hand. So Franz Fallen has a question on the variation in tendencies, how parties reacted after the joint government. So he asks, or he had the impression that there's quite some variation and not so much a uniform tendency of these 5 parties once they entered government in one of the graphs. And for example, with the FPÖ dramatically increasing its share of anti-elite messages. Could you put forward an explanation for this variation or put this in perspective to some extent, please?
Yeah, maybe I should say again that these were antagonisms, right? But within these antagonisms, there are changes occurring over time. So for instance, before government participation, I'm not 100% sure for the FPÖ, but this is more general observation. For instance, the government was often opposed to the people, right, of not accepting the people's will. Of course, this antagonism does not occur that often when populists enter government, right? They might juxtapose previous governments with the people, but instead they focus on other elites, right, opposed to the people. For instance, now it's the Social Democrats, right, which are the enemy of the people or not accepting the people's will, not speaking for the people, or other parties, right? So there are shifts. But you talk about the frequency. So of course, in some, the frequencies are changing. Let me just have a look at this table again here, because you see that the antagonisms between the people, political elites, economic elites, there is no dramatic increase, right? But you see this increase regarding the antagonism, the people versus non-native outgroups in government. And this may indicate that, and this was also one hypothesis we formulated, depending on the coalition partner. This is, it depends strongly on the coalition partner, right? So while, for instance, the ÖVP in Austria may not be very happy with strong populist discourses, they may have no problems with nativist blame attribution, right? And we know that, I mean, with Kurz as supposed new leader, nativist messages were no taboo anymore regarding the center-right in Austria. So I think there was actually no reason to stop talking about non-native outgroups as a problem for the native society, because the center-right mainstream party just did not have any problem. But if you look maybe now at the end of this table, New Zealand first, you see that I mean, usually this is not a typical radical right parties, but to some degree they also talk negatively about non-native outgroups. They decreased the amount. And I could argue that this may be because this is a center-left party as a coalition partner, which maybe have more problems ideologically to oppose non-natives to the supposed native society, right? So it depends, I think, strongly on the coalition partner, and this may explain why nativist messages may even increase in government.
Excellent, thanks a lot. There are a couple more questions. The last question, the Q&A, is about how the electoral support affects then this level of antagonism in the discourse of populist parties, right? So does increased confidence in vote share makes them more hostile or more willing to adapt certain strategies, or would it moderate their positions?
Exactly, this is often assumed, and I actually had a look at it, and I tested these theory of electoral decline. If this makes parties more prone to change discourses, this is often assumed, but I couldn't find that. So some populist parties increased their vote share and started constructed more antagonisms, while other lost votes and did so as well. So there was actually no no linkage I could identify, right? And this is why I conclude with this assumption from Moffat that it may not depend that much on the electoral performance or on external events that populist parties change their discourses, but they might change them because they want to be the agenda setters and they want to dominate the party system agenda with their issues. This would be like one potential explanation I found more or less reasonable.
Excellent, many thanks. Please feel free to post more questions in the Q&A function. Raise your hand. Oh, somebody actually raised his hand. So Jose, I'm going to allow you to speak.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. And I found that what you show, the data about Spain, that's the country I'm also studying, and I'm also doing similar type of analysis, content analysis of Vox and Podemos. And I also find in my research kind of this, that it resonates a bit with Moffat, idea of performance, and maybe why they don't decline in their populism once they reach power is because also they have available new tools also to kind of recreate or reframe these kind of crises. And now, if you follow in the elections, the electoral campaign in Madrid, you can see how Podemos has increased drastically the populist tone, as well as Vox. And they seem to feed into each other. I don't know if you have seen this kind of connections between different groups in your research. But now, for example, in Spain, they have the campaign has turned into Podemos is just saying like, well, you have either democracy or you have fascism. So they are kind of trying to link Vox with fascism, but also Partido Popular, the center-right party as well. So yeah, I think as you've shown your data, that probably anti-elitism as such has been reduced, at least what it comes to economic elites, but there's still the same logic of antagonism, in this case to exclude political opponents, at least what you see in the case of Spain. But thank you very much, and sorry for this long comment. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think this is right, and I think both populism and nativism are very flexible ideologies, right? So they can adapt to new also discursive opportunities, and I think, I mean, we had last month we had this seminar session about the pandemic and right-wing populism, and there might be indeed some periods, yeah, I mean, issues which are present, which might benefit or not benefit, where populist parties can benefit from or not, but they still are able to adapt to these new situations. And me and my colleague from Spain, Ben Fernandez Garcia, we are just we're working on a paper about these discursive adaptation during the pandemic, right? And we saw the very similar findings that if there are possibilities to use populist blame attribution, they do so, and they try to link everything possible to it, or also to nativist blame attribution, right? And as you say, maybe sometimes a lack of opposing economic elites to the people are compensated by other targets opposed to the people, right? So this is the flexibility, and this may also be the reason why the total amount of antagonisms does not decrease in government, right? Because they still can compensate it in some way. And thank you for your comment. I think I totally agree with you.
Perfect, many thanks. So Maurits Meyers had a comment. Do you want to switch on your camera or mic?
Yeah, I will do that. Hi. Yeah, thanks, Jakob, for this really interesting presentation. And I think it's really great to to hear about your work and the ways you've looked at the communication on Twitter by these populist parties. I have two questions. I think the first one relates a little bit to the question of Jose previously. Is it possible that there's a different type of anti-elitism at play here, or maybe is that possible but not something there that kind of appears in their communicative strategy on Twitter? Because I was thinking, you see that, for instance, Orban, when in government, he started targeting different types of elites, right? So obviously he was the domestic elite at that point, but he was targeting EU elites. Have you seen something like that in your analysis?
I actually measured the European Union as elites as well. I just don't remember if there was anything like that. And what I can say is that yes, they change. I mean, they continuously change. Like the amount of different types of elites juxtaposed to the people, they vary over time. So yes, there may be differences in government, and I would agree with you. But I think one idea what I had was that maybe, now I remember, that antagonisms between the government and the people might decrease in government, right? But maybe such, as you said, like the European Union juxtaposed to the interests of the national population, that such kind of non-domestic elites may be more often addressed. But this was not the case, actually. I actually assumed that, but I should have a look into the data again, but as far as I can remember, this was not overrepresented in government, these European Union as main type of target juxtaposed to the people. But what I saw is that, for instance, opposition parties are, of course, blamed more often in government, and sometimes economic elites are more often blamed in government. I think this depends very strongly from, as I said before, from nation-specific or country-specific developments within the society and within the party system agenda.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, super interesting. I'm just going to follow up with one last question, because I was also struck by the fact that the general conclusion that you didn't really see anti-elitism going down, because in previous work with Andrei Zaslav, actually, we compared our populism data with the Chapel Hill, which measured anti-elite salience. And there, for instance, you saw in the case of Orban's party Fidesz, you saw that it wasn't really thought to be anti-elitist, but it was very populist. So how do you think your findings speak to that, to that finding we had, or we found?
Yeah, I mean, I focus here mostly on Western Europe, with this exception from New Zealand. And of course, I could imagine that in Eastern Europe, there are also other dynamics, party system dynamics at stake. So I mean, the case that Orban and his party is not just the junior partner in a coalition, but the main actor, for instance, may allow them also to successfully adapt to new discursive opportunities, right? So they may, I mean, also in the context of press freedom and all of these things. So they not only can set the agenda, they may also be able to I mean, they can, in some way, they can control the media, right? And they can actually have some impact on how strong their messages spread in society. And this is not the case in Western Europe. In these countries where what I observed, right, their populist parties, except the Italian coalition, were mostly junior partners with the mainstream party. And I think this may be, despite the fact that Orban is labeled as populist, I think this may be one reason. And the other reason is that Orban's populism is also, I mean, fed by very different types of host ideologies and motivations, let's call it like that, maybe different than those from the Western European populist parties I observe. That would be at least kind of reasonable, I think.
Perfect. Many thanks for the response. Are there any other questions? Anybody has an important question to ask? Oh, Ander has a question.
I don't know if it's an important question, but I can ask a question. I mean, I find this really interesting. I mean, I find it interesting, and on the one hand, I mean, I like it, and maybe not surprising as well. I mean, in the sense that, especially when I'm hearing you talk, if I get it correctly, the fact that it's the anti-elitism doesn't change the salience or the amount, but the targets do change a little bit, I guess. So that's interesting. I mean, but I'm wondering again, this question has been brought up a little bit, and just to sort of to push it maybe a bit further. I mean, so Facebook, right? I mean, that's interesting, because I mean, in some sense, I mean, I'm not a media expert, but I mean, I get the sense that you're talking to your supporters, huh? I mean, it's a. So I'm wondering if this, I mean, but that doesn't make it, maybe it makes it even more interesting, because I'm just sort of wondering if maybe they even have a dual strategy. So I'm kind of thinking about the work from Duncan and Daniele, where they actually find that that populists in government can also be very pragmatic. So I mean, maybe they combine this, and that would be very interesting if to their supporters they're like, hey, look, we are still populist and still keeping that mobilization going, which we saw in Salvini as well, you know, his constant campaign that goes on. But then juxtaposing it with maybe, you know, a more pragmatic notion as well. So just a thought, but I mean, I guess wondering as well, you haven't done research on this, but I mean, maybe one would expect in Parliament, what they say in Parliament, to be different, to be less populist, and would be maybe interesting to contrast, you know, when they're in opposition, what do they do in different venues such as the Parliament, and then what do they do when they are in government, and even over time, you might even see that changing. Just sort of a thought. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And I would agree that we might observe different degrees of populism on other platform or other sources. But maybe I wouldn't agree that, I mean, I agree that Facebook is mostly for the own supporters, but I think it's also important for the media actually to know what politicians say. And it's not just restricted to the own followers. So the media reports about certain stuff occurring there on these platforms. So, I mean, therefore, I think it's not only a very niche source, but I think it would be worth to focus on other platforms as well, as you said, like parliamentary speeches. Maybe this is totally different. Yes, I agree. I think there are several papers out there which show that certain populist parties are pragmatic in government in the sense that they, but this is mostly related to policies, I think. Right, so which policies they actually favor and which whatever laws are executed, but not that much on discourses. So what actually could be interesting is, or what seems to me very reasonable, which interpretation is that they may remain radical in their rhetoric, but they might adapt their policies, right? So these are two different dimensions, and they are not mutually exclusive. And this is maybe how you could solve this puzzle.
Thank you.
Perfect. Many thanks for the question, Andre. I see that there are no more questions, and therefore I would like to hand over to Annika for a couple of closing remarks, please.
Well, thank you, Robert, and a big thank you to Jakob for doing this whole session by yourself. In the name of the Australian political science, I'm very sorry that we have lost the Australian here. Being from Australia, of course, I was also extremely happy to actually see the New Zealand case being brought up, which is very rare, even though it's a fascinating case. And all the Kiwis strenuously deny that things like radical right and populism even exists in their country. well, from looking at it from the outside, it seems quite obvious. So thank you so much, Jakob, for sticking to this and handling all these questions extremely well, and giving us all your insights into your research. And I would just like to, as a closing remark, just point you all to next month's session, and I'll just share my screen again. And next month we will have, and we will make very sure that all of our presenters will be here. And if we have to go and knock on their door in person, next month, last Monday of the month again, and this time the session will be on populism and democracy. We'll have two presenters, Sarah De Lang and Rula Nesi, who will present from their research. And yeah, and I hope to see all of you again there, and very much looking forward to that discussion as well. And last but not least, thank you again. Thanks, Jakob, for doing this session with us. And thank you all for the audience, for your questions, your comments, and just sharing this hour with us. See you all in a month's time.